Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and welcome to this special event which we describe as a public debate between two big thinkers. One, our guest from abroad, Mr. Bill Emmott. All of you would have read his rather long biographical background, so I think we will just say that he is a prolific writer, a big thinker, and knows Asia very well. And we look forward to listening to him. Our Singaporean man is Dean Kishore Mahbubani. In other words, my boss, so I have to be extremely polite about introducing him. But actually, I should just say he is the Dean of the LKY School of Public Policy and another big thinker. We are always left wondering what he comes out next. So hopefully today we can get some clue of what he's going to do in the school in the coming months from his comments. Again, his biographical data is on the notice and the flyers. So if you don't mind, I'd like to get the show immediately off to a good start. Okay, silence being consent. We shall now proceed with our event today. And in the Dean's office just now, the two of them agreed that as good Singaporeans, we should let our guests start the ball rolling. So I would like to invite Mr. Bill Emmott to the stage. The way we will do it is that each of them would have 10-15 minutes to make their presentation, make their case, and then they can argue among themselves for maybe 5 minutes. And if there is any more time left from there, it's over to you. Yeah. But as a chairman, I shall ensure that there must be 30 minutes for all of you who have gone through very difficult journey up this hill, find parking lots and sweated yourself to now sit down. So you should have your moment under the camera or in this room. So let's have the last half an hour for your questions and your comments. Okay? So without further ado then, Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you all for a very generous welcome. I come at the invitation of Dean Mahbubani to debate a topic of his choice in his school, with his choice of ambassador to act as umpire. So you can see I'm beginning at a disadvantage. The reason for the choice of title, I should explain, which region is more geopolitically incompetent, Asia or Europe, is because in Kishore's very interesting book, the new Asian Hemisphere, in one of the later chapters, he gives a ranking of geopolitical incompetence. The lowest is the Soviet Union, with 2 out of 10. Then the unkindest cut of all is that the second lowest, in his view, is the European Union, with just 4, below even the United States. And top of the list is China, with 8, or 9 even, he says. My second disadvantage is that I've spent my career as a journalist. And the journalistic training and instinct is to consider all governments and all regions to be incompetent. Therefore, choosing between Europe and Asia, is quite difficult. But I have one advantage, and that is that Dean Mahbubani has written in his book his arguments against Europe, and therefore I know in advance what his views are. He may not know what mine are. So his criticisms of Europe are essentially 4 criticisms. 1, the European Union has not shared its peace and prosperity with its neighbours. Second, that it failed dismally to deal properly with the war in ex-Yugoslavia, the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. Third, that it has not achieved or found a strategy for itself independent from that of America. And fourth, that it hasn't come to terms with the rise of Asia, that it hasn't seized opportunities provided by the rise of Asia. So I'll start by answering these four criticisms before talking then positively about Europe and negatively about Asia. The answer to his first accusation, that Europe has not shared its peace and prosperity with its neighbors, is that the point of the European Union is that we keep redefining who the neighbors are by moving our garden fence. We started with 6 members, then 9, then 15, and now 27. So we keep on sharing peace and prosperity with our neighbors by bringing them inside the garden. 27 members now, the largest expansion of which took place in 2004 with 10 new members from mainly Central and Eastern Europe. We have shared peace with Central and Eastern Europe, compared particularly with the time when I grew up, in which Europe was divided, and I barely knew that Budapest and Prague and Warsaw existed as a child. Now they're part of the European Union. He accuses Europe of neglecting North Africa and not sharing peace and prosperity with North Africa. That overlooks the fact that for all the North African countries, apart from the Middle East, which sell oil to the world, Europe is the biggest trading partner for all those North African countries. And the European Union is also the biggest aid donor to Africa as a whole. He accuses us of neglecting Turkey. Turkey, our great Islamic neighbor, is a member of NATO, our major Europe-based security pact. Turkey is in the waiting room for membership of Europe. Unfortunately, President Jacques Chirac of France did not take the advice in an Economist leader of supporting Turkish membership of Europe at an early date. But Turkey will, I would confidently predict, become a member of the European Union within the next 10 or 12 years. Second, the Balkans. Yes, Europe did fail abysmally in the Balkans. It did fail to come to terms with, to get on top of the civil war on its border, and it indeed made things worse by different countries in Europe offering recognition to the countries that split away from the former Yugoslavia at different times and in a competitive way. But let's compare that form of political incompetence with Asia's record with civil wars. Sri Lanka has just, it hopes, come to the end of a civil war that lasted 26 years. Aceh and East Timor were civil wars in a member of ASEAN. Separatist wars, what did Asia do about those? Asia's record in dealing with civil war, which is what the Balkans War was, civil war within what had been Yugoslavia, is no better than Europe's. And since the Balkans War lasted less than a decade and the Sri Lankan War lasted 25 years, the Pakistan-India conflict has lasted, well, we don't know yet. I would say that Europe's record was no worse than Asia. Third, we don't have an independent strategy from America. What Kishore doesn't realize is that Europeans are cunning people. We use America. We share about 80 or 90% of our interests with America, and therefore we use them to achieve our goals. And we hide behind the fact that as a result of that, the world hates America much more than it hates Europe. For the 10 or 20% of our goals where we disagree with them, we do have independent positions. After all, only Britain, Italy, and Poland actually sent troops into Iraq. France actively opposed it. We had an independent policy of negotiation with Iran before the Americans did. We do have independent positions. But let's ask how independent Asia's strategy is from that of the United States. Asia relies on America for its security, essentially. Many Asian countries are in bilateral alliances with America. Is Asia really more independent of the United States, except China? I would wonder. And finally, have we seized the opportunities in Asia? I think that this accusation is partly true. I would concede him that. This week's meeting of the ASEM summit in Hanoi was a case in point, where European countries brought shame to European hearts by sending junior ministers and not foreign ministers to attend this summit. I would concede that point. But let's not forget that the European Union is China's biggest export market, its biggest trading partner taken as a whole. European companies are big investors in Asia. European governments have been individually very, very keen to build ties with individual Asian countries. So I think not guilty is the right conclusion on Kishore's 4 accusations. But what about positive views of Europe? The most positive point about the European Union, which in his book he does agree with, is that basically we screwed up the first half of the 20th century with our geopolitical incompetence, namely that we fought 2 world wars against each other, stimulating wars in the rest of the world as well, and we've had a rather better record in the second half of the 20th century and so far this century. So we have brought peace by ceasing our previous form of geopolitical incompetence. We have also, as a result of the decline of our empires, the dismantlement of those empires in Asia as in other parts of the world, we have renounced the old heavy-handed European approach in Asia as in the rest of the world. Indeed, the whole essence of the European Union is non-heavy-handedness, a sort of intellectual disarmament program whereby we agree never to come to an agreement about what to do. So we renounce the sort of heavy-handed decisiveness that might rank as geopolitical competence, but in many eyes would rank as interference and arrogance. Third, we have been remarkably successful in trade, in achieving a common trade position as a coherent negotiating party in the WTO, in having a more advanced antitrust and competition policy than any other portion of the world, and most of all in launching a single currency, which 15 of the 27 members of the European Union are currently part, and which has helped many of them to survive the global financial crisis unscathed in the way that they would have been highly scathed before. But finally, the European Union's geopolitical competence is shown, I would suggest, by the fact that this is a club that countries seem to want to join. If we were so geopolitically incompetent, why are people queuing up to become members of the European Union? And the queue to leave the European Union consists only of the British Conservative Party. People keep on wanting to join, including Turkey, including Ukraine, eventually, including other countries in Eastern Europe. This is a club that surely, by the length of the queue, suggests that we are, in fact, pretty geopolitically competent. What about Asia? What's the reality of Asia? Well, very briefly, because I need to give time to the Dean. But the reality of Asia, I would say briefly, is that Asia doesn't exist as a geopolitical entity. There's no genuine Asian geopolitical position. There's no Asian Union. There's no collective Asian position. The big influence that Asia's had in recent negotiations has been by blocking them. India and China getting together to bring an end to the Doha round of the World Trade Organization, possibly thereby colluding with the great enemy of the United States, but very much against the initiative for a successful conclusion to that round that was being pushed by the European Union. ASEAN, as the most well-developed community of Asia, is a very weak entity by comparison with the European Union. it has achieved a peace between its members by ignoring civil war, violence, and all sorts of actions by the members. The ASEAN Charter is a charter of hypocrisy, in my opinion, that has no legitimacy or reality. Fourth, Asia, too, with the single exception of China, has no genuinely independent strategy from the United States either, and with less influence over the United States than Europe does. And finally, as I said earlier in talking about the Balkans, Asia in recent years has had more civil wars and more people dying in civil wars than Europe has. So, in conclusion, everyone's lousy, in my view, but Asia's even lousier than the European Union. Thank you.
Dr. Tan, Professor Wang Gangwu, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. You know, Bill began by saying that the dice were loaded against him. What many of you may not know is that this man is one of the intellectual giants of the world. It was thanks to his leadership that The Economist went from being a British weekly to becoming a global weekly and is now the single most widely read magazine around the world. So, in a sense, the odds are stacked against us, Bill. And you can see how smart he is. Even before I could launch my arguments, he already launched a preemptive strike against everything I was going to say. So I've got to throw away my arguments now. But seriously, but at the same time, I want to emphasize that this is actually, even though Bill and I are good friends and we'll do this in a good-natured fashion, this is actually a very serious debate. And actually, it is the issues that we are going to debate today that will determine the course of the 21st century. And that's why this debate is a very important one. And here, the first point I want to emphasize at the very outset, just in case it's not being clear, is that I am not anti-European. I am actually pro-European. I want Europe to succeed because I believe that a successful Europe, especially in the geopolitical sphere, is very good for the world. And indeed, when the Europeans become geopolitically incompetent, it's not just Europe that suffers, it's the world that suffers. So all of us should work together to improve the geopolitical competence of Europe. And I also want to emphasize that Europe has done, and I'm glad that Bill mentioned the positive things that Europe has done, and I agree with all of them. In fact, I think my pro-European arguments are even stronger than his pro-European arguments. I will make three. The first thing is that, of course, the whole world should send a thank you note to Europe. Because, frankly, if Europe hadn't modernized first, if Europe had not succeeded first, if you hadn't had the European Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the incredible revolutions in science and technology, my life would have been much, much poorer. The reason why I have experienced a dramatic improvement in my lifetime from where I was when Singapore's per capita income was the same as Ghana's in the 1960s to where it is today is basically because of the gift of modernity from Europe to the rest of the world. And for this, I think Asia should thank Europe for its gift of modernity. The second positive point I'd make about Europe is that Europe, in some ways, has reached the peak of human civilization, because in Europe, within the European Union, you don't just have zero wars between any two EU member states. You have zero prospect of war. Now, believe me, there's no other region in the world, barring perhaps the United States and Canada, but Canada doesn't have a chance anyway, so that's why there'll be no war between the United States and Canada. Barring that, there is no other region in the world where you can say, in this region, there'll be zero prospect of war. And that, I think, is one of the biggest gifts that Europe has given to the world. And of course, the third big gift that Europe has given to the world, and again, I completely agree with Bill, is, if you're looking for a gold standard of regional cooperation in terms of how countries can actually cooperate in win-win arrangements, again, no other region can come close to what the European Union has achieved. I'll give you just one example. I remember when when Europe launched the euro, the single currency, I was very skeptical. I thought, this is a bridge too far. This is going to fail. How can you have countries with different fiscal policies and a single monetary policy? But amazingly, it's worked. And Europe, and as you know, the euro remains one of the strongest currencies of the world. So there are phenomenal achievements of Europe that we should recognize, that I recognize, and that's why I think I want the success of Europe to be shared around the world. But at the same time, if you ask me in my gut, what do I feel about the future of Europe? I would say, honestly, I feel very pessimistic. And the reason why I feel pessimistic is that for a continent that used to dominate the world almost effortlessly, 18th century, 19th century, first half of 20th century, and when you dominate the world, you do so through the highest geopolitical competence. You think strategically, you act strategically, and essentially, for some strange reason, Europe has lost the capacity to think strategically, to think long-term, and to think about where the challenges are and what Europe should be doing about them. And that, I think, is a very dangerous situation that Europe has created for itself. Because if it carries on in this way, it is going to come to grief in a fairly serious way. Now, the three examples I'm going to give, I have actually been mentioned by Bill already, but I'm going to elaborate a bit on them. Now, he's right when I talk about the European Union's failures with its neighbors. Now, believe me, within the European Union, you have enormous peace and prosperity. That's why everybody wants to join the club. Frankly, Singapore should also join the European Union if it could. Wonderful. Membership is great. You get tremendous amount of benefits and very little price to pay for it. But just at every side of its border, whether it's North Africa, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the Balkans, whether it's the Caucasus, or frankly even Russia, you just look at what the European Union has done in those regions. It is creating long-term insecurity at its borders. And the best example of this is North Africa. In my book, I have a chart that plots the relative population of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. There was a point in time when that population of the region was much less than Europe. By the year 2000, it's about the same as Europe's. By the time it's 2050, it'll be almost 3 times the size that of Europe's. So what is the European Union doing to export its peace and prosperity to its neighbors? Okay, it trades, it gives aid, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the nature of North African societies. That's why if you had to make a prediction, you predict that all the troubles are going to come from North Africa. It's obvious. Now, if you want an example of geopolitical competence in the same dimension, look at what China has done with ASEAN. China started this free trade game long after the Europeans started free trade. And yet, miraculously, it was China that proposed a free trade agreement to the ASEAN countries. And so the world's largest free trade area is going to be created within China and ASEAN. 1.2 billion people in China, 500 million people in ASEAN, 1.7 billion people coming together. So why can't the European Union do the same with North Africa? Have a free trade area, export your prosperity there, build stronger societies, and remove long-term threats. And the reason why Europe doesn't do that is because it doesn't think strategically over the long term. And that's a major problem. Secondly, if you look at a somewhat larger canvas and you ask where are the bigger problems Europe is going to face 50 years from now, it's very obvious. One, obviously, is from the entire continent of Africa. What happens in the continent of Africa? If it goes well, Europe will benefit. If it goes badly, Europe will suffer directly. And so we would assume that the European Union would have a long-term policy of strengthening African states. Instead, you have European policies which undermine African states. Let me give you a concrete example. I'm sure you've all heard of this, the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, the purpose of the Common Agricultural Policy was to help European farmers. There was no intention to hurt Africa, but it has hurt Africa enormously. Because when you have agricultural subsidies and you export your subsidized agricultural products, you destroy the African economies and you create poverty. And as a consequence of that, if you were to monitor on a chart, the number of Africans trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe keeps increasing. It's a result of European economic policies that destabilize African countries and they export Africans to Europe. Is that a sound long-term strategy? No. It's unwise. Europe should be doing the exact opposite. And then if you take Europe's relations with the Islamic world, and this is an old, old story, okay? It goes back to the Crusades. It goes back to 1,000 years ago. It is also the case that it is in Europe's long-term geopolitical interests to carry out policies that minimize or reduce anger in the Islamic world towards Europe. Because the Islamic world is an ocean away for America, but it is right on the doorstep for Europe. And guess what? Instead of supporting policies that minimize anger, Europe is supporting policies which has increased the anger towards Europe. And of course, the best example of this is European policies on the Israel-Palestine issue. Now, it's pretty obvious that the United States policy, and I'm not giving a big secret away, even Americans say this, is extremely unbalanced, right? And therefore, American politicians cannot push for a two-state solution to Israel and Palestine. And this is where, if Europe was geopolitically competent, the first thing it should do is to push as hard as possible using all the combined weight of the European Union and say, we must have a two-state solution. Because with a two-state solution, you'll get rid of the prime source of anger in the Islamic world. But instead, sadly, if you look at it, while you get statements which are independent, when it comes to the crunch, the European Union has not behaved independently. And as a consequence of that, America is far away, Europe is near, it pays the price. And finally, again, in terms of long-term strategic thinking, clearly the 21st century, I mean, by now there's almost no doubt about this, will be the Asian century. And if you assume that it's going to be the Asian century, you would assume that Europe would take the initiative to engage Asia. And clearly, the Asia-Europe meeting should have been a European initiative. Instead, guess what? It was an Asian initiative. It was the Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, who proposed it. And guess what happened after he proposed it? Initially, And I know because I went around marketing ASEM when I was in the Foreign Service in the mid-1990s. Europe embraced the Asia-Europe meeting because they said, great, we can get together with the Asians. So the first meeting we had in Thailand in the mid-1990s was a great success. And then guess what happened? The Asian financial crisis came along. And when the Asian financial crisis came along, the Asian economies tumbled. And this provided a valuable opportunity for Europe to tell the Asians, don't worry, we are not fair weather friends. We will be with you in your good times. We will be with you when you go into your crisis. But when the Asian economies tumble, Europe turned back and said, forget Asia. The Asian century is a myth. And they essentially carried on ritualistically with ASEM, but lost all their interest in it. And this is a perfect illustration of the incapacity to see, hey, beyond the Asian financial crisis, the Asian economies will recover. And amazingly enough, the Asia-Europe meeting idea would provide powerful geopolitical benefits to Europe also. Because in this world, there are three major centers of power: North America, Europe, and Asia. North America has got strong links across the Pacific to Asia. North America has got strong links across the Atlantic to Europe. But Asia and Europe do not have strong links. And hence, North America in the middle can tilt one way or another. But if you create a triangle of North America, Europe, and Asia, it's a stable triangle, which each one having equal geopolitical opportunities.
Thank you, Kishore.
Yeah.
Time up.
Thank you.
I better tilt the balance back into balance, otherwise I'll be having to contend with Bill for, giving too much time to the dean here.
Oh,
okay,
he can have
Bill.
more time. It's fine.
Yeah. You have any rebuttal to what Kishore said?
Sure. Where should I begin? Where should I? No, I mean, in terms of the specific points that you made, Kishore. I mean, first of all, you say that we're creating long-term insecurity on our borders. I think that's factually incorrect. We're doing our best in the Caucasus and in the Balkans to reduce insecurity. We do have a problem called Russia, and our relations with Russia are, shall we say, difficult. But I think that that's wrong in that direction. North Africa, well, first of all, you say we haven't fundamentally changed the nature of North African societies. Well, isn't that a good thing? I mean, we tried to change the nature of societies through colonialism, which wasn't a terribly constructive policy, I would suggest. And I don't think that we should be trying to fundamentally change the nature of societies. I don't think that China is fundamentally changing the nature of societies in ASEAN either. And that's a good thing, and I'm glad that they're not. But I don't think you can set that as the standard. And finally, on North Africa and trade and the common agricultural policy, I would bow to no man in my hatred of the common agricultural policy. I've spent 26 years working for a magazine that was founded in 1843 in the cause of free trade in food against the Corn Laws in Britain. And we've been fighting a losing battle ever since, all over the world, not least in Asia, by the way, where Asia has just as bad agricultural policies in several countries as Europe does. That's not to say that Europe's bad agricultural policy should be defended just because Japan, Korea, actually India, and all sorts of others have just as protectionist an attitude. But let's see whether this really hurts Africa as much as you say. We do have pretty much free trade with Africa, thanks to preferential trade agreements that have been established under the Lomé Convention for decades now. Under the Doha round of the WTO, the big gains that African countries were expected to make, according to independent non-European economists was actually in expanded trade with other emerging markets, with India, with China, with Latin America. And it's that they've been blocked off from. Now, I think that we should scrap the common agricultural policy, and that would help some African countries, there's no doubt. But we don't, let's not assume that it would be a miracle for Africa. After all, the common agricultural policy supports essentially dairy and cereals production as its prime targets, and secondary olive oil and wine. And those are not strong products in most African countries. We're not competing head-on with Africa so much there. So I think that your criticism is wrong as far as that's concerned. On Europe and the Islamic world, I think that we have been ineffectual on Israel and Palestine. However, we are, I think most governments and officially, in favor of a two-state solution. Even President Obama has said this week that he's pressing for a two-state solution and he wants a halt to settlements. The problem of Israel and Palestine is the very strong American nexus on that. And I think that despite your kindness in suggesting that the European Union has great weight in the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's no sign actually that that's true, I think. Perhaps that's defeatism from this European. But we Europeans don't believe that we have great weight. Maybe we should believe that.
Thank you, Bill. Kishore?
Just, since I've taken up too much time, just 2 quick points. First one, the point about changing societies. To avoid misunderstanding, I'm not advocating return of colonial rule.
No.
Okay? But if you look at the story of Asia, what's remarkable is how one Asian country succeeds, Japan succeeds, and then the Four Tigers copy Japan, then they succeed, then the ASEAN countries copy the Four Tigers, then they succeed, and then Deng Xiaoping comes to Southeast Asia and says, hey, why is China so far behind Singapore, KL? Then China transforms itself, and now India has opened up. So there's a kind of a march to modernity that has spread across different societies and cultures. And one of the great historical mysteries is why that Europe was the first continent in the world to modernize, and yet 300 years have passed, and that march to modernity hasn't crossed the Mediterranean across to North Africa. Now, it could be a result of defects in the North African societies, but actually I have suggested even in my first book, Can Asians Think? It was a sort of a failure, it was a kind of strategic decision somewhere in Europe that we don't have to share modernity with North Africa because it doesn't matter. Whereas I think there should have been a strategic decision made 50 years ago. It's in our interest to encourage modernization and we should support it. And that didn't happen, I think. Because I think aid doesn't do it. It's more than required. But anyway, what's happening in Asia is a spontaneous transformation that hasn't happened there. On the Doha round, by the way, you're much more of an expert than I am, Bill. But my understanding is that the last round collapsed, ostensibly because China and India blocked, as you know, the deal. But there was one other final issue that wasn't resolved, which was the cotton subsidies for West African cotton farmers. And since the United States did not want the round to break down over American refusal to kill the cotton subsidies, they wanted the breakdown to be over China's and India's refusal on the temporary safeguards, whatever it's called, safeguards thing. So it was a strategic move to blame China and India for the failure. But frankly, those involved in the negotiations knew that the real reason was that the United States was not ready to give up the cotton subsidies. So the agricultural subsidies of the United States and Europe have been a fundamental obstacle to the liberalization of the trade order. And I suspect you probably agree with me on that.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree with that, Kishore. I think European criticism over the denouement of the Doha round shares it equally between the United States, India, and China. We have an equal opportunity form of criticism, and we would agree with your analysis. We do, though, criticize Asian agricultural policies as well, at making this difficult, and it's very notable that all the free trade agreements that are signed involving bilaterally or regionally Asian countries, agriculture is notable by its lack of presence in those agreements. Agriculture is a real fundamental point. I think on your point, just to go back on the sharing of modernity, I don't know how Europe would have done that. I mean, as you say, the process in Asia was spontaneous. I mean, we never shared modernity with Japan. Japan responded to what it saw as the threat, actually, of European and American colonialism by deciding to import modernity after the Meiji Restoration. And then eventually, in the 50s and 60s, as you say, this process went across borders wonderfully in Asia. But it wasn't because anybody had a strategic plan.
Okay. I think we have heard enough of the two thinkers. Yeah. Now, I'd like to turn over the floor to you, ladies and gentlemen. But may I make a request? Since we have many students and friends who seldom come to the LKY school, we'd like to encourage many of you to speak up. So many friends I see from the media, please hold your question and comment for the time being, and let's see how far we can go with our rare visitors from the schools and the academia, and see what kind of fireworks we create, and then the media can come in to sing the last hooray or something. All right? Can we, yes? The gentleman at the back there. Please use a microphone.
Good afternoon. My name is Tan. I'm from Singapore. Basically, what I'm interested in is the European Union position on climate change. On one hand, the European Union is pro-Kyoto Protocol. You're calling for reduction of emission all over the world, including Sir Nicholas Stern from UK. On the other hand, you're encouraging the use of biofuel and biodiesel in Europe up to a stage of 20% in 2020. The fuel mix, that means that you use biodiesel or biofuel from agri-based, food-based crops, which causes deforestation in third world countries, thereby causing more emission at the end of the day. So where do you stand? You're pro-Kyoto Protocol on one hand, on the other hand, you're encouraging the deforestation which causes more carbon emission at the end of the agro-feedstock cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take a few more questions. Ambassador from the EU. Sorry, there's no circulating microphone, so you have to go to the microphone.
Yes, I'm Holger Standerschild. I'm the European Commission ambassador here. Just a couple of comments, no questions. First of all, I would like to comment Kishore when he mentions that in North Africa we should have free trade agreements as a solution. There were free trade agreements negotiated, but all of those countries, the first one in 1977. So I don't think that is the solution that we should do. We have done that. It hasn't worked as well as it should have done, basically because the trade has been hub and spoke between the countries themselves and Europe. They have not been regionally integrated. The countries, especially in North Africa, in Maghreb, they don't trade with one another. They have not created new industries. The industries are the same as have been there. So that is one thing. On the Palestine issue, I'd also like to just point out that EU, over the years, has supported enormously the Palestine. We've had free trade agreement with them. All the reconstruction efforts that have gone in, all of that has been done by the EU. A lot of the trade that goes into or has gone into Palestine had to also be administered by Israel. So there has been a huge aim at trying to find a peaceful solution between those two countries. So I don't think that is a correct statement. Just those comments.
Thank you, Ambassador.
And I'm going to add that we, of course, kindly also from my country exported Tony Blair to Palestine.
This is one of those non-merchandise export.
That's right.
Next comment or question? Yes, please.
Okay, you go first. Oh. All right, thank you. I'm JT from the LKY School of Public Policy. I'm an MPP student. Now, this question is directed to Mr. Emmott. Now, regarding Europe's geopolitical competence, even within the EU itself, it seems that in 50 years' time, the demographics of Europe is going to change dramatically. For one, it has an aging population. The second part is that of the births that are occurring in Europe itself, how much, very little of it, from reports that I've seen, seem to be from ethnic Europeans, more from immigrants from other cultures, other countries, other societies. And it seems that there's a distinct lack of integration going on. So in previous years, remember there was the Denmark cartoon incident where we saw a lot of riots even within Europe itself. I can't help but think it is a sign of times to come, that eventually there will be fractures within Europe itself, and this is not going to bode well for anybody. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Sir, please.
John Burton from the Financial Times. I'm surprised you haven't mentioned the effect of the current financial crisis on your thesis. And you see, for example, that in some ways Asia has had a very good crisis in the sense, despite the temporary downturn in growth, that China has become the world's largest creditor nation. It's propping up the U.S. economy by buying all those treasury bonds, for example. And in contrast, you see Europe, and there are worries, for example, that we could see the euro system fall apart. Will the German taxpayers, for example, be willing down the road to bail out Greece and Spain and Ireland? Thank you.
Okay, John. All right. Maybe since there's now we have a commentary from EU ambassador, we take one more question.
My name is Lim Sui Keng, Singaporean, a writer and an inventor. I think maybe there's a significant lack in understanding of Asian culture. Bill should have known that if the subject title is provided by Dean Kishore, he has all the rights and the articulations to change. But he did not. That shows a geopolitical insensitivity about the generosity of Asian. The next, when you talk about change, you talk about colonialism and all those things. There are more ways to change, like what Dean Kishore has shown. The Japanese has collaborated with the Asian nations to bring up our ways of economic prosperities. That shows geo-economical incompetence, does it? That change can only be changing the nation's political system, changing the economic system of Asians or of North Africa. I think it is important to see that there are many ways of change, although change is the only constant. We have to see. I think that's why Dean Kishore invited you here to see the generosity and the wide mind of Asians. Thank you.
Okay. We have Mr. Sikri from India. Okay, the rest of you with question, hold on after this. Mr. Sikri, please.
I just wanted to make a few points. One, I think the broad point which Kishore was trying to make, which didn't come out, is that Europe is so involved in its internal affairs that it doesn't have the time to give the strategic attention to the rest of the world. On agriculture, if I may, since India was mentioned a couple of times by Bill, it was the West which took agriculture out of the WTO, and there was a separate agreement on agriculture because it was a sensitive subject. So one can hardly say that the developing countries or the Asians are now insisting on agriculture because that exclusion was done by the West because they want to protect the agriculture. Were there a level playing ground, then it is possible that Europe and the United States would suffer. The third point which Bill Emmott made was on there's no Asian identity. Might I suggest that if there is a European identity, despite the centuries of bloody conflict, which have been much more bloody than whatever Asia may have experienced, and yet you feel that there's a European identity, I think there is a nascent Asian identity. It's not yet fully developed, but I think it is developing, and it's a work in progress. Yes, there are the rivalries, but if the basis of the European identity is the Judeo-Christian, the Greek-Roman empires and stuff like that, I think in Asia there's also a certain cultural thing, the emphasis on society rather than the individual, harmony and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't really underestimate that. And finally, you say that only China has a genuinely independent strategy. Well, I think China has an independent strategy, but as the financial crisis has brought out, it is so hopelessly dependent on the West for its continued prosperity because of the trade linkages. And one of the accusations against India had been that we were not bowing to the West for many decades. So that was an independent thing, but just wanted to make that one. Thank you.
Okay, now let's go back to Bill before we ask Kishore to respond.
Yes, I think this is, although I absolutely understand the generosity of my friend Kishore and of Asians in general, I'm not sure that I should treat the fact that all of the questions have been directed at me as proof of this generosity. So, answering them a little bit. I think, obviously, the climate change question is a very complicated one. Where would I stand? I absolutely would stand for economic rationality on climate change, and I think that biofuel as a theoretical form of cleaner energy is a great mistake, and I'm absolutely against the use of that to target that. I would actually impose a carbon tax in every country that's willing to agree to that, and then leave companies and individuals to make their own choices on the basis of that, rather than directing money as the Europeans have done on biofuel. Second, on demographics, and really the question was about integration of immigrants of different kinds in Europe. I mean, Europe certainly has a demographic problem. There's no doubt about that. We have an aging and shrinking population in many countries. That doesn't include Britain, where the population has been rising, but it certainly includes Italy, it includes Germany most strongly. The birth rate actually has risen in recent years in France and in Sweden, which may just suggest that they're better at romance than we are. And I think the integration issue is a serious one in many European countries. But let's understand it. I mean, what Europe needs is immigrants. Europe needs immigrants. Europe has immigrants. Europe has been pretty open to immigrants in many European countries. The biggest Muslim population in Europe is in France. Probably one of the highest per head will be in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. Europe needs immigrants, and we do need to work out how to integrate people properly and to learn from Singapore's model of multicultural living and multicultural politics. I don't think there's any sign of fractures right now, but of course this is an important and dangerous issue. Third, briskly on the effect of the financial crisis, is China propping up the United States? Well, it's the old saying, when you owe your bank $100, you have a problem. When you owe your bank $1 million, the bank has a problem. I think China knows that it has the problem. America owes it, in a way, $2 trillion, and it ain't going to repay it. And the problem is for China. It's a problem of currency evolution. There's one major economy in the world among the top economies. China is the third biggest economy in the world. One major economy does not have a convertible currency and a more or less freely floating exchange rate, and that's China. And that's why China has $2 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. So I think in the long term, China has the problem. In the short term, China is certainly more robust. So is India. Very good GDP data out today from India showing it growing better than was expected. India has been affected by the financial crisis thanks to its current account deficit. It's a borrowing country. But I think that the common fact about this financial crisis is that it is global, I'm afraid. The sickest banks in the world are in Germany. Some of the worst contractions in GDP are in the Baltic states, in Japan, I hope not, but perhaps in Singapore. We share this, unfortunately. It's a crisis of globalization. And then finally, Europe, is it too involved with its internal affairs? I think the answer is yes from the point of view of strategic global thinking. I think that's absolutely right. The question, though, is whether that's a good or a bad thing from the point of view of other regions of the world. I think probably where Kishore and I most seriously have a difference of view on this is as well, what do we want regions to do geopolitically? And I'm very interested and encouraged by your view, Kishore, that that the world is suffering from Europe not having a strategic view. I have to admit I slightly incline towards the Ronald Reagan view of government, which is the most fearsome words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And I slightly think that if the European Union was trying to exert its influence and strategy around the world, it wouldn't be so positive. But since it hasn't tried, I can't prove this. And I'm very interested by your rather positive view of what Europe could be doing if it wasn't so involved in its internal affairs.
Kishore?
Well, very, very briefly, he's right. Most of the questions were for Bill. But the last point is the most important one. I mean, is the world better off with a Europe that is completely internally focused? Busy
completely.
Discussing, the latest. I mean, if you talk to European diplomats, most of the time, they spend so much time arguing among themselves what the EU policy should be. So by the time they come out of the negotiating room, the world has already moved on. And that's a major negotiating disadvantage. And I think the critical thing here is that what we have to ask ourselves is, at a time when the world is changing rapidly, when we're seeing the greatest shifts of power ever in human history, when we have to work hard to create a stable world order, it's not going to happen automatically. A stable world order is the result of a tremendous amount of work and effort. And at a time when we should all be focused on the global geopolitical stability, the best minds in Europe are engaged in talking among themselves about internal European issues. And that, as a consequence, leads to Europe making decisions which I think in the long run will damage both Europe and the world. I mean, just to take one concrete example, let's take the whole Turkish case, for example. Frankly, I've said this in my book, so it's a very sensitive point, but I've written it public, so I can say it publicly again. The main reason why the Europeans oppose the entry of Turkey into the European Union is because they believe that Turkey will be an Islamic Trojan horse in the European Union. It will bring in 80 million Muslims that will enter Europe. But frankly, the effect of Turkey joining the European Union is that you may actually have a European success story in the Islamic world. And Turkey will then become, frankly, the role model country, just like Japan was for Asia, and can then over the long term transform the Islamic world and create more modernizing states. So it is in Europe's interest to see a modernizing Europe, and therefore it is in Europe's long-term interest to bring Turkey into Europe. I know you agree with me on that. But the reason why it will not happen is because all the discussions are focused on short-term costs, immediate costs of bringing Turkey in, and nobody can see the long-term strategic benefits. And the big difference, the reason why China's geopolitical competence I rank so high, I can tell you that when the Chinese meet internally to discuss foreign policy, almost the first thing they ask is, where do we want to be 20, 30 years from now? And how do we get there? And what compromises do we have to make in the short term? What price do we have to pay? And do we have to suffer, so they say, swallow bitter medicine? They'll do it. So they have a kind of a long-term vision, and they are working towards it. And one of the best examples of how, in a sense, irrelevant the EU has become is in Rajiv Sikri's new book that he just gave to me. When he walked into my office today, I said, so how many, I said, I'm preparing for this debate, this book of a few hundred pages. I said, how many pages do you have on Europe? He said, 1.5 pages. He said, that's enough.
Okay, pause there. Bill, you want to reply about Turkey and Islam?
Yes, I'm just going to reply on Turkey and Islam because I can't let that pass. I mean, the truth is that the reason Turkey is not on the fast track to be becoming part of Europe is not to do with Islam. I really believe that it's not. It's to do with fear of cheap labor. It's an economic fear of importing cheap Turkish workers. We had enough controversy over the Polish plumber in Europe and the effect in 2004. Don't forget how recent it is. The admission of the 10 countries, 8 of them from Central and Eastern Europe. We had a huge amount of controversy about the effect of that on employment and wages and so forth in European countries. I think wrongly, of course. I'm in favor of admitting those countries and admitting Turkey. But that's the fundamental blockage on Turkey. That's what unifies the different countries that are opposed to it. Of course, there are voices who are worried about being an Islamic country. But there's huge Turkish community in Germany already. This isn't a fundamental problem. Europe is not a single religion, Judeo-Christian society.
Okay. Yes, there's Gillian there, and this gentleman at the middle here, right at the back. And yes, the man with the hat, with the cap. Ladies first, all right?
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Gillian from IPS. I think that Bill tried to form his argument primarily, on the strength of the internal self-regulation of Europe as a region. I'd like to draw the Dean on the question of how well Asia does that. How well is the community of nations in Asia dealing with some contemporary issues, and let's just take Myanmar to begin with, and North Korea. Contemporary issues today, and I'm not sure if, Dean, you'll win the argument on this unless you've got a good one up your sleeve.
Okay, this gentleman with the cap.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Wee, Singapore citizen. In geopolitical terms, Asia as a region, specifically China, seems they have a distinct advantage over Europe, considering its geographic, demographic, and its present economic factors, i.e., its large land mass, its large population with implication of a vast market, and its exuberant economic growth. Now, still, it does not go far enough to bring about a geopolitical competence that is most desirable if the country concerned does not have a sublime political worldview, that all nations should work together for the prosperity of all, In Chinese, it says 世界大同, the commonality of the world, as a political philosophy. Do the speakers agree? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, that gentleman, and then we have ambassador here. No, wait. Let this gentleman make his. The guy at the back, yeah.
Hello, I'm Andrew Wilfred. I'm currently serving in national service, and I didn't go AWOL to be here. My question is for Dr. Mahbubani, Professor Mahbubani. You mentioned that a lot of your examples were basically on the Caucasus and basically what I would call festering ulcers for Europe. I would like to mention, or at least ask you to comment on, say, the festering ulcers in Asia and what Asia has done to fix it. You know, you have like China and Taiwan, you have North Korea, you have Sri Lanka. I mean, Sri Lanka's conflict has gone for 2.5 decades, and the only people that came in to negotiate were people from Norway, from Sweden, basically European countries. I'm wondering why didn't Asia step up to the plate at that point in time? And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Willem Blanket, European Commission, and once a fellow at this Lee Kuan Yew School. Let me first say I think that it is constant and permanent misunderstanding about an inward-looking European Union. One reason is perhaps that indeed we have outward problems that we, as Bill put it, internalize. We were very active and I think successful in Eastern Europe. And now indeed it's, as far as it is still a problem, an internal problem. We mentioned Turkey, which is definitely today not yet an internal problem. We have a strategy, or at least thoughts and a policy towards the Middle East conflict. We are not very successful, but who is successful in the Middle East? And I think if there's one policy that concerns the whole world, where the European Union, and okay, it may sound a bit like a chief of propaganda, but let me be, that is today a debate. That is the thing that concerns the whole world, and where I think the EU is a very active and strategically forward-looking, 50 years ahead party, which is in the front line, which is climate change, where indeed I agree with the earlier speaker. The biofuels were not a very good idea, but having it put on the agenda of the world debate, we have been very early, and we can only be happy that finally now the United States is also turning into a responsible stakeholder. So maybe you have some comments there.
Thank you. Kishore?
Okay, I think the questions to me from Gillian and the gentleman were basically about Myanmar, North Korea, Sri Lanka. Let me make one point very clear. Asia is not in heaven. There are lots of problems in Asia, North Korea, Myanmar being the obvious ones. But what's amazing is that if you look overall at the trend line in Asia, right, the three biggest wars since World War II were fought in Asia. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Sino-Vietnamese War. And if you were here 20 years ago making predictions about where Asia would be in 2010, very few would have said, hey, the guns will be silent in East Asia. And that's what's happened. So the trend line in the region has been remarkably positive. I remember reading in the 1990s, right? And I quote these writers in my book, by the way, who said that, hey, if you look at Asia and you see this incredible power shifts happening, what you're going to see is a replication of Europe in the 19th century. So Europe's past is Asia's future. You should have been seeing rising levels of tension. You should have been seeing all kinds of regional disputes. Instead, the trend line has been the exact opposite. And that's quite a remarkable development that has happened. Now, there are exceptions. And certainly, North Korea is a major exception. But ask yourself this question. Is North Korea a sunrise or a sunset country? It's a sunset country. At some point in time, it's going to collapse, like East Germany and so on and so forth. We don't know when, but it's going to collapse. the ultimate solution will come. In the same case of Myanmar, the more the government of Myanmar refuses to change and adapt and open itself to the rest of the world, the more the problems will suffer. But the pressures upon, if you had told me 5 years ago that ASEAN would issue statements critical of Myanmar, I would have said no way. But it's happened. The ASEAN countries are now as critical of Myanmar as the European Union. So there are changes that are coming. So the trend line in Asia is a positive one. Now my concern is that the trend line between Europe and its neighbors 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, I don't see a positive trend line. And that, I think, is a big difference.
Bill?
Well, I would just say two things. I mean, one, I was actually quite cunning in agreeing to this debate topic that Kishore suggested, because actually in his book, he in fact compares China and the European Union. And China, I would agree, looks much more favorable, and we are absolutely in agreement with that. Their geopolitical strategy has been very clever and good and positive, I think, by and large. They find themselves in some difficult situations, including in North Africa. But nevertheless, they have been good. Much better, though, than Asia. And I don't believe that Asia as a whole has had quite the same line of progress. It's not that long ago since we were fearing nuclear war between Pakistan and India. 6 years ago. 7 years ago. 6, 7, whatever. Embassies were being evacuated from New Delhi for fear of conflict. The armies were marched up on the border. The trend line, I agree, is positive, but I think it's perhaps not positive enough. And final point, I'd just like to point out, in case anyone thinks that Europeans are not properly interested in Asia, two things. One, of course, immodestly, I'd point out that I'm here, and that I've spent my career writing about Asia. But secondly, let's look at the important security meeting that's happening in this town starting today. The Shangri-La Dialogue, the major encounter between defense ministers and security officials in Asia, is organized by a London-based think tank, which has the great privilege of having Kishore Mahbubani on its council, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. This is European policy and strategy in Asia.
Thank you, thank you. I am told that our speaker will have to go to another event which is connected with this Shangri-La Dialogue. Yeah, Kishore Dean has to go too. So I think we should wrap this up when there seems to be so much cordiality at this moment. Yeah? But maybe by a show of hands, how many of you agree that Europe is geopolitically incompetent? Well, Bill, you score. You see, after your appearance here, nobody believed that anymore. Right. Thank you very much, Bill and Kishore, for having this wonderful debate. We hope that both of you can think of another topic and come back again for another round.
Perfect. I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.